I have been a country doctor for 41 years, and I have learned one thing about people that no medical school will teach you. Most of what a person carries, they carry in silence. They carry it to appointments, and into waiting rooms, and across fields in the early morning dark. And they never once put a name to it, and neither do you. You learn to read the weight. You learn to recognize the posture of a man who has been bearing something for a very long time. I recognized it in Edmund Vane the first evening I ever saw him, which was the autumn of 1986, when I pulled over on the Aldford Road with a flat tire, and he came across from the far landing in that flat-bottomed punt of his, without being asked. He was about 40 then. Neither of us said much. He put the spare on while I held the torch, took nothing for it, and went back across. I watched the punt disappear into the far bank fog and thought, there is a man who has been doing quiet things for quiet reasons his whole life, and not one person has noticed. After that I saw him most weeks. The ferry crossing at Aldford Beck was 2 planks and a rope pull, and Edmund Vane ran it the way other men run their breathing, without apparent thought, without apparent effort, as though the river itself had simply arranged for him to be there. Farmers used it. School children used it in the mornings. The old Henwick estate gamekeepers used it in the season. Nobody talked much to Edmund. He had a face that discouraged casual inquiry. Not unfriendly, just settled. The face of a man at permanent peace with something the rest of us were still searching for. He came to the County Agricultural Society dinner because Martin Aldershot, who farmed the south acres of the Henwick estate and was on the membership committee, had decided that Edmund qualified as Associated Rural Trade and had put his name forward. I don't think Edmund had wanted to come. He sat at the far end of one of the long tables in the old granary at Thornfield, a magnificent room, Victorian brick and iron, the roof beams dressed with harvest garlands, and he ate his roast beef and drank his half-pint of bitter with the same composure he brought to everything, and he did not speak unless spoken to. There were perhaps 55 of us that evening, the usual assembly, tenant farmers and landowners, a couple of estate agents, a feed merchant, 3 members of the county council. At the high table sat Gerald Croft, the society's chairman, a man of considerable self-regard and modest achievement, who had inherited 700 acres from his father and managed them adequately, and who wore his chairmanship the way other men wear a good overcoat, with the implication that it had been earned. I had known Gerald for 30 years and liked him well enough, when he wasn't performing, which was roughly 40 minutes in any given evening. The dinner wound down. The port went round. There was the usual business, the annual awards, the crop reports, the treasurer's summary, and then Gerald, who had been on his 3rd glass of Burgundy since the fish course, pushed back his chair and looked down the room in the way he had, the look that meant an announcement was forming. He had seen Edmund at the piano. There was an upright against the south wall, a broadwood, old but serviceable, kept there for the society's Christmas gathering and the occasional fundraising evening. Edmund had not sat at it. He had simply paused beside it on his way back from the lavatory and laid one hand, very briefly, on its lid, the way you might touch the shoulder of someone you knew. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Gerald Croft saw it from the high table. "Edmund," Gerald called down the room, loud enough that the conversations nearer him thinned and stopped. "I didn't know you were a musician." Edmund looked up. "Give us something," Gerald said, and there was a smile in it, the kind of smile that has already decided where the joke lands. A river song, something the old bargeman would have known, something to finish the evening off. He raised his glass at the room. "I think we'd all enjoy that, wouldn't we?" There was the laughter of an audience being invited to agree with the host. A river song, something simple, something the room would enjoy. I watched Edmund. He did not flush, he did not bristle. He looked at Gerald Croft for a moment with that settled face of his, and then he looked at the piano, and then he stood up. He walked to the bench without hurrying. He sat down and lifted the lid and touched the keys once, lightly, with the back of his right hand, the way you test the temperature of something. The room was still half in conversation, half watching, the way rooms are when they've agreed something is going to be mildly entertaining. Then he began. The first note was a single B, low and deliberate in the bass, and it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The conversations that were still running stopped, not because the note was loud, it wasn't, but because it had a quality of intention that was difficult to ignore. the quality of something that knows exactly what it is doing and is in no hurry to explain itself. He played the opening bars of the Liszt B minor sonata. I did not know, in that moment, what I was hearing. I am a doctor, not a musician. I know enough to recognize Chopin from Schubert and Schubert from Beethoven, in the broad way that a man who has lived near the sea all his life can read the weather without ever having studied it. What I knew in those first 30 seconds was that something extraordinary was happening in the room, and that it had nothing to do with river songs. The Liszt B minor sonata is a single movement, 30 minutes, in a concert hall, under proper conditions, and it is among the most demanding pieces ever written for a solo pianist, technically and emotionally. It begins in near silence, a slow gathering statement in the bass, and then it gathers and gathers until it breaks into something that can only be described as enormous, not in volume alone, but in what it contains, the whole argument of a life, pressed into 88 keys. Edmund Vane had, apparently, spent the better part of a lifetime learning to play it. The room understood this in stages. By the end of the first minute, the last of the side conversations had died. The waitstaff, who had been clearing dessert plates at the far end, had stopped moving. Gerald Croft had set his glass down. By the end of the third minute, the great lyrical second theme had arrived, a melody of such aching, uncomplicated beauty that it seems almost wrong that it comes from the same piece as the opening's controlled fury. And I heard, from somewhere to my left, the sound of a man clearing his throat in the way that men clear their throats when they are trying not to cry in public. By the end of the fifth minute, I had given up trying to understand what I was hearing and simply let it happen. This is something I have only done twice in my life with music. I am not, by temperament, a man who surrenders to things. 41 years of general practice builds in you a habit of assessment, of keeping one part of the mind separate, watching, noting, categorizing, and it is a habit that serves you well in consulting rooms, and not at all on occasions like this one. The music simply took that habit away. I sat in the old granary at Thornfield, and I listened to a man I had known for 20 years tell me something he had apparently never had words for, and I felt it, in the way you feel the diagnosis you have been half-reaching for finally arrive, the recognition of a truth that was already there, that only needed to be named. He played for 12 minutes. It felt both much longer and much shorter than that. The sonata in his hands moved through its opening argument with a precision that was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was the precision of someone who has had a very long time to understand what every phrase means and has decided to spend none of it carelessly. Each transition was exact. Each dynamic had been thought about, not in the calculating way of a performer performing, but in the way that a man who has worked alone for a very long time develops his own relationship with a thing he loves, free of the audience he never had. There were moments of such ferocity that I felt the candlelight in the ceiling brackets tremble, and moments of such stillness that the entire room seemed to contract to the width of a single phrase, held just a beat longer than you expected, the way a man holds a rope at the final pull to let you step off safely onto the far bank. When he reached the passage that moves from the second theme back into the darker central material, the place where the piece seems to gather itself for what it still has to say, I realized that I had both hands flat on the table in front of me and had been pressing them there, without knowing it, for some time. The man to my right, Clive Harker, who breeds Hereford cattle, and has never, in my knowledge of him, expressed an opinion about anything that couldn't be measured in pounds per acre. Clive Harker had his eyes closed. Edmund brought it to a stop at the first great structural resting point, not an ending, but a place where the music draws breath before its final argument. He did not play the full second half. He simply let the last chord resolve into the room, and then he lifted his hands from the keys, and there was silence. Not the silence of an audience waiting to see if it is over. The silence of a room that has had something very large happen inside it, and has not yet found its way back to ordinary time. It lasted, I think, close to 10 seconds. Then Martin Aldershot stood up at the far end of the table, and then the couple beside him, and then the room came to its feet in the uneven, unstudied way that it does when nobody is leading it. Not together, not rehearsed, just person after person finding, independently, that sitting down was no longer the right thing to do. Gerald Croft was the last to stand. He rose slowly, the way a man rises when he is making a private calculation that has nothing to do with the room. He did not look around to see who was watching. He looked at Edmund Vane, who had turned on the bench and was sitting with his hands in his lap, waiting, in the same way he waited for passengers on the far landing, without impatience, without expectation. Gerald Croft said nothing. He put his hands together, and he clapped, steadily, and he did not stop when the room stopped. He clapped until Edmund stood and nodded, once, and sat back down. Then Gerald Croft sat down too. He picked up his glass. He said nothing further. That evening, that I heard. I spoke to Edmund as we were leaving. The coats were being brought round and people were pressing toward the door in the way they do when an evening has run past its natural moment. I told him it was the most remarkable thing I had heard in this room, or any other. He received this in the way he received everything, quietly, without deflection, without false modesty. I found the piano, he said, when I was about 17, before the ferry. I had lessons for a while, from an old woman who lived on the Fordham Road. After she died, I just kept going. I asked him why he had never played for anyone. He considered this seriously, the way he considered things. There never seemed to be the occasion, he said, and it didn't need an audience. It was enough to know it myself. He put on his coat and walked out into the night, and I stood at the door of the old granary and watched him go, and I thought about the river crossing at Aldford Beck, the flat-bottomed punt, the rope pull, the morning fogs, and I thought about the thousands of crossings he had made in 40 years, farmers and children and gamekeepers who had stepped off his landing and walked away without a second glance, and I thought that perhaps this was what it meant to carry something for a very long time without an audience. Not loss, not concealment, but a kind of patience so complete, it had become its own form of wealth. He retired the following spring. The ferry crossing closed. There is a footbridge there now, concrete, council-built, functional, and you can cross it in 30 seconds, and you never think about what it costs to get from one side of a river to the other. I still think about Edmund Vane. I think about him the way I think about certain patients, the ones you treated for years without understanding what they were, and then one day something shifted, and you saw the whole of them, and you understood that the seeing was the privilege, and that they had been carrying it patiently, all that time, just waiting for the occasion.